Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we discuss the movie Grosse Pointe Blank 1 minute at a time. I am your co-host, Hugh David.
And I'm your other co-host, Dev. And on today's show, we're going to be looking at minute 72 as Debbie and Martin continue to do the rounds at the high school reunion.
And joining us on today's show, talking of reunions, all this week, we have back with us movie superfan Kosmas. Kosmas, how you doing?
I'm awesome. Thank you for inviting me back, and it's great to be back.
Yeah.
Especially because in the last minute we didn't talk about it, but there was the Greco-Roman thing, yes, which I have no idea how it works, but I'm Greek, so I guess it fits.
Yeah,
there we go.
We need to start with that, I reckon. So,
yeah.
Dev, do you want to fill us in on Americans and their Greco-Roman tendencies?
Yeah, so we had Nathaniel kind of burst into the scene, played by Patrick O'Neill, who, kind of introduces at the end of last minute Martin and Debbie to Eckhart and can't remember the other guy's name. And they are apparently a couple of wrestlers. I wasn't entirely sure. I mean, at least one of them is definitely from the high school because they've got a badge. But it sounds like he's training them to be professional wrestlers, like Greco-Roman style wrestlers or something. I mean, for the kind of character that you see Nathaniel as of being like this kind of like bit of a waster, it just feels like a really odd interaction, doesn't it? It's like
the pair of them look like bodyguards, right?
They absolutely do.
They just stand there and don't say anything, and I keep wondering if he's simply trying to cover up the fact that for whatever reason, like, is he in witness protection? They're just standing there. But yeah, the Greco-Roman thing's interesting because, of course, Americans have this fascination with, because of when America was founded in 1776, you have this obsession with that the British had at the time with classical culture, which leads to American institutions having columns and porticos and all this kind of thing, but it also leads to the idea of the Greek letters that they use for their university societies. And because of that, one of the things I've noticed is there's a real obsession with like toga parties, and that's partly American 70s movie reference, but also something they did do with these things as a way of kind of, keeping with the Greek Roman / image of these societies as being places that people get together and, help each other succeed at college and university.
I mean, there's also something to say there about imperialism and kind of this somewhat idolatry of what in the West, at least at the time, was seen as the greatest of empires, right? One that spanned the known world and lasted for, however long it was, a few hundred years. Significantly longer than the pink stain of the British Empire on the map.
Yeah, we're not bitter about that at all. A couple of Indians with English backgrounds talking about the British Empire. Like, we're here because of that, sadly, whether we like it or not.
I mean, it worked out well for us as individuals. I'm not sure it worked out well for the planet as a whole, let's say. And it's also, like, it's mentioned before in this film as well, right? Because Kenneth McCullers was an all-state wrestler. So, it feels like it's a thing here. It's also, like, it's definitely something that is still pretty prominent in high schools as a sporting option, much more so than I remember seeing in the UK.
Well, wrestling in general is there's more of it now in the UK than we used to have, but it's been around the UK as long as I can remember. It was a big 70s wrestling scene, but then as well as and then it tailored off a little bit after the end of the 80s, and now it's back again. But I also find it interesting that the American obsession with wrestling is, and it's not just manifest in the big international conglomerate that is the World Wrestling, but also just in a more localized sort of version. It's very much a thing that is encouraged as a sport, like a sport, not like a soap opera fake thing. It's a real sport. And of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson famously was a very good wrestler, even as he got into university and became a great physicist. And I think that's always fascinated me, the idea that you would be both, you would make the effort to be both. I think we've kind of lost that. Everything is very much you go one way or the other.
Yeah.
And he was quite happy to be both. And there's something to be, as someone who's very, very unhealthy at the moment. I often say to the kids that I teach that I'm the reason, I'm the perfect example of why being a nerd is bad for you in the long run. It's genuinely a thing to look at very, very intelligent and intellectual people like Tyson and go and see their respect and their interest in physical activity. I don't, not that this conversation in Grosse Pointe Blank represents any of that, but you know what I mean. It's interesting to see it come up in this context. But then, of course, we cut to something very, very weird, which is he decides out of the blue to comment on the relationship between Debi and Martin.
Yes, and I think this is... It feels like it's him trying to relate to celebrity, right? Like it's him trying to be buddy with Debi. Like, I called into the radio show. You know who I am. I'm a cool person as well. Like,
right,
cool by association, right? Like bringing that conversation back up and like trying to play it out as a joke, but really trying to like be that touchstone of like, hey, like me because I call into the radio station. I'm that guy. That's how it felt to me.
Yeah, I mean, there was it used to be a thing, didn't it? I mean, again, this is one of those things that does date the film, the 90s thing, where it's, it was minor celebrity to be answered on the radio when you rang in, right? It's like I can remember this being such a thing, particularly since if you had landlines, you had to be near a phone to do this, right? So before we had mobiles, you'd be like, in a van, like in my case, teacher training, a whole bunch of us trainee teachers in a van being driven to the town with the schools or coming back in the evening. And you're listening in the afternoon, and you're listening to the radio, and you're listening to the call in, and you're like, oh, we can't call in. And I seem to vaguely recall one time towards the end of the term where one of the guys in the van actually asked us to pull over to a phone booth so he could ring in something, and then we could all, and then we drove on from there, and they could, and then we could hear the message that he did, and it was just, it's kind of crazy. That doesn't really exist anymore. I guess it exists in the sense of, oh look, she liked my comment on Instagram or what have you. But
right, and that's it, right? Like it's having that shout out or being able to start up a DM with someone that you idolize on social media, right? Like, I kind of I can totally relate to this. Like it's a thing, or just seeing someone in the street and being like, oh, I know you. Like there's this kind of the celebrity thing is evolved, but it's still definitely there. And I feel like this is that mid 90s expression of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah,
and then we move
on
to Tanya's introduction.
Yes,
a very, very early feature from Jenna Elfman in a neck brace, talking about her transcendental experience of losing it on some ice in Lake St. Clair and washing up in wherever it is.
It is such an odd moment in a film that's full of them. I keep trying to work out, right? I don't think we've explicitly addressed this, but we've mentioned quite often in the course of these recordings the kind of contrast between post-80s corporate America and a more hippie-esque side of American society, right? And like there seems to be this thing, like, because I can remember in the 80s as a teenager, I remember that like the 60s and 70s was so relatively recent, and you would meet people who would qualify as under the, or would, counterculture, hippie, whatever you want to call it, right? And but by that point, the majority was already more conservative. Treat you that we were being taught to treat people like that as odd, as strange, as not the norm, even though there was a distinct, segment of the population who had views alternative to the mainstream 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
And I keep feeling like this film is dotted through with that kind of contrast, right? Martin he's not the kind of person to do yoga, or, I mean, like, I imagine that he does have a fitness regime, right? Even though we don't see it.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a cynicism about people who speak or talk in a more kind of ethereal, emotional way, right? And she's definitely like, I mean, this almost feels, because her big role in Dharma and Greg will start in this year on
Yep.
TV, and this feels like a dry run, right, for her hippie character.
It definitely feels that way. Also, interestingly enough, Mitchell Ryan, of course, is also in Dharma and Greg.
Yes, of course.
And he plays Debi's father in this movie. For those of you not with an encyclopedic memory of every cast member in this film, but so I'm kind of wondering if, like, part of this kind of came about as a result of this movie, maybe more directly, or if it was just happy coincidence that they were both there.
It would be interesting to find out, because it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while it happens that you get the I think Jeanette Goldstein, who was in Aliens, described it as when she and a bunch of them all got hired again as a group for Near Dark with Catherine Bigelow. She said Catherine hired us as a job lot. The idea was that they knew each other, they had chemistry together, they'd worked together, and so it was like, yeah, perfect. We'll just hire the group of you, because it was Lance Henriksen, Bill Paxton, and Jeanette Goldstein were all hired together for Near Dark because they'd been in it. That was literally the selling point.
Interesting. I wonder if some of the behind the scenes crew overlap as well in that case, because obviously Jenna Elfman and Mitchell Ryan don't actually have any on-screen time together in this film.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering if it was something that was built up off camera that kind of drove this.
Yeah,
which would require
the other
an
possibility
in-depth
is
comparison.
I think the key issue would be, is it the casting director?
Mm-hmm. Could well be.
Things, yeah. It took me a long time to notice how often the sequel, seeing actors I knew turn up in various productions was directly related to casting direction, not actually just the directors themselves.
I know you mentioned casting. I mean, the audition process. Did other people talk for the role or audition for the role of Debi? Maybe Jenna herself. Because if she did, then she might have interacted with her father, and then they met through that. So I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there without any.
Point.
Yeah,
I
it's a
hadn't
really
even thought
interesting
of that.
point.
That would make a point. Yeah, I don't know how late or early they cast Driver.
I think I remember hearing that other actors did try out for the role.
Mm-hmm.
So it could well be that Jenna Elfman was one of them. I'm not seeing an overlapping casting, but I'm still looking.
Yeah, I'm having a quick look now.
Interesting. So there's a casting department for the film, but I'm not sure if there's a... Oh, here we go. Jeannie Laurie Johnson, Ron Surma. Ron Surma's a pretty...
Yeah, maybe even the same casting people just that did then Dharma and Greg.
I think it's just friends of friends potentially, because it feels like the casting for Grosse Pointe Blank was very much film casting, and the casting for in both Jeannie Laurie Johnson and in Ron Surma are both very much film casters, whereas Nikki Valco, who is the casting director for Dharma and Greg, is very much a TV caster. She did Jag. She was involved in Dharma and Greg, obviously. Ally McBeal, Malcolm in the Middle. Like it's a whole roster of like some of the most successful American TV shows. 2.5 Men, Boston Legal. Like it's Big Bang Theory. Very, very, very prolific casting director. Young Sheldon as well.
She's one of those people who, I've always noticed, I was a big fan of Dharma and Greg, but she's one of these people I've always felt like deliberately took a back seat after that to just, be a jobbing actress rather than have a starring role. It's like she did it. She knew what it was like. And she's like, okay, you know what? I want to balance my life out a bit more, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah.
So I found a film article from the Midwest Film Journal, which seems appropriate, from 2017, looking at Grosse Pointe Blank in their series on the class of 1997. And they make the point that one of the things that this scene is doing is it's showing us how Martin is not the only person full of hang-ups and all these bits from the past bothering him. So to quote the writer of this article, it says, his old classmates form a menagerie of missed opportunities and misanthropic regrets. There's subdivision security guard territory, which we talked about in an earlier episode, who acknowledges his badge is in no way, quote, a meaningful symbol. Then we have Tanya, who insists on an otherworldly near-death experience that no one takes seriously. And I think that's the point, isn't it? That's the point, is we're seeing all these things, and actually, it's all for laughs, but also Martin and Debi are teetering between finding what's going on around them cynically amusing and utter horror. I feel like the pair of them are kind of scared. They're there and they're like, oh no, this is what's going on. We're actually not the only people like this, as well as their whole distancing from them.
And it's interesting that that's kind of surfaced as horror in they're kind of horrified that like everybody else is making it up as they go along, whereas I feel like if I were in that situation, when I'm in that situation, I generally feel slightly mollified and comforted that everybody else is also a complete mess. It's not just me. Like, and I think that maybe that being a complete mess is kind of part of their identity in their own minds, and they're losing that as they talk to these people. It's like, we're not so different. We're not special. We're not able to separate ourselves from everyone else in the way that they hoped. I think that they're the kind of group that revel in otherness a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right.
But is it also bewildering to them that they wanted to relive the past and now they see the past? Because as Hugh already mentioned, I don't think she would have been different back then. I think she's the same. She just had this experience.
I mean,
she would be the same person even back then. So they see them and they don't want to go back there anymore.
I think
you know them.
I think they knew that going in, right? Neither of them originally wanted to go to the reunion, right?
Yeah.
Martin got kind of bullied into it by Marcella, and Debi kind of got bullied into it by Martin. And they're both realizing this is exactly what we feared it to be in a lot of ways. It's like, it's a bunch of people that we don't have a lot in common with. We'd rather not be wasting our time speaking to, and we're stuck here and we can't really extricate ourselves. And the excuses for moving on to the next group get increasingly like less convincing and like harder to really like sell off, until it's just like, should we go somewhere else with like no apology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I think is interesting is, of course, in '97, the X-Files is big as well, and Elfman fits the bill of that kind of slightly odd possible alien abductee. the way Cusack and Driver look at her and go, "Pardon me." Is very X-Files. They look a little Mulder and Scully-ish, and then Elfman's like, and then I got to the threshold. Mozart, music, flowers, poetry. Like, what are you talking about? And then the cut back, you've got a really low angle on the camera looking up at both couples, and there's all the lights up above, which again feels very kind of alien.
So
Not just X-Files.
It's interesting that you frame it as both couples, because I feel like the guy that's stood next to Tanya that gets no screen time or dialogue whatsoever.
True, is not with her.
Is not with her because she's just been explaining all of this to him, right? Because they enter halfway through. But also, he's just like, I think, also looking for an out and is not quite as rude as Martin and Debi are, and willing to just be like, we're not interested in this anymore. We're out, like Dragon's Den style, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But and then finally is the irony of them saying, "Wait, how did you die?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, I stepped on some ice."
Yeah.
Suddenly we're back in normal territory. It's just like whoop, bam, done.
Yeah.
And you can see the relief on Martin and Debi's face when they look at each other, like say, "Oh, thank God for that."
Yeah.
You know, we're done now. We've heard the story. We can move on.
And I think I've mentioned this in a few previous episodes that this character is inspired by Joan Cusack, and I could never quite remember what the film source of it was. I don't think we've actually said it on air because we looked it up before we started recording today. It is from Joan Cusack's character in 16 Candles. So this is...
It's an overt John Hughes nod.
Yeah. So, and it, like, if you've seen 16 Candles and you remember Joan Cusack in that, you'll get it right away. It's basically kind of the same character, same setup, kind of a deal. So
yeah, exactly. And in a film that feels like it's busy revising and satirizing the John Hughes era, this is probably one of the few direct nods. I don't think there's anything else that's actually that literal a nod to it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel like this film has a lot more hints and nudges and nods towards Say Anything than 16 Candles. I feel like John Cusack's character as well, it feels like he's an adult version of Say Anything, John Cusack.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think Jenna Elfman gets away with being a little less awkward than Joan Cusack does in 16 Candles. So
I love how cheerful she is. I love. I mean, it's that classic thing that we associate with Jenna Elfman in terms of roles she's done in the public persona. You know, she's just so upbeat about what's happened to her. Like, I lived. It's like,
yeah. I lived and I got to see the other side and come back and like I know what heaven is like now, kind of a deal. Yeah. Which I think is enough Mozart to drive anybody nuts after a while, apparently. So.
I can't remember who said it once, but and I know I've adapted this over the years to different versions, but someone once said something like, if you die and when you open your eyes, you don't hear. And then you can put in the musicians of your choice, right? But it was something like, I mean, the one I always do is if you don't wake up and you don't hear Jimi Hendrix jamming with Prince and Miles Davis, you're not in the right place, right? But the version was something like, Bach and Charlie Parker or something. Do you know what I mean? But it's that sense of how do we define the other side and what it is, and I love that idea that Mozart is part of us.
I guess for some it would be hearing Nickelback. I guess then it would be hell, right? No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, I don't want to be there if that happens.
No.
I mean,
there's a documentary coming out, by the way. They did a documentary, but that's a different. Love to Hate Us or something.
Wow.
Looking forward to watch that. But that's a different story.
Got to give them credit for just embracing the hate. Like, I mean, they are a hugely successful band, even if there's a huge number of people that really, really dislike them. So, it's something to be said for that. Kid Rock is kind of the same.
Hanson thing, right? And then that was a 90s thing, the Hanson family.
Yeah,
they were hated a lot too.
Although they were a bit more of a one-hit wonder. I mean, Nickelback has been pumping out albums for years upon years. Like, it's a really impressive catalog.
That's true. But back to this one, because a thing that I noticed was the blow a fat one lingo. I mean, I'm not into that lingo kind of stuff, but is that still something people say today?
Oh, in terms of the
it's
reference to getting.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's
a blunt,
I'm
right?
sure if
Yeah.
it's something we can talk about. Or,
Hey, it's legal
something
here,
because
baby. I mean,
so there you go.
statewide, not federally. But yeah, so I mean, obviously, it's a reference to smoking a joint of weed, of cannabis, of marijuana, whatever you want to call it.
Is it still called that? Like, if you
Getting
would
toasted?
I
take
think it's
someone would
I think it's a very 80s, 90s term, probably 80s term. It feels like it's old. But I mean, also like a lot of that lingo for cannabis culture in California, at least, has kind of died down because it's just, I mean, you just go and get some, and it's not like you're not adding the mystique of the alternate
Alternative.
names anymore
Yeah.
because it's not illicit, right? You go and get whatever you want to get, and it's so I think a lot of those 60s and 70s terms are still hanging around for folks who just want to use them in a somewhat ironic sense, but also like a lot of the time it's just a vape pen these days for folks.
So where you live then, Dev, is you guys have dispensaries?
Yes,
Right.
a lot of them.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, quite a few. It depends, like city to city, obviously, because like permitting for usage. But like as soon as the city lightens up on it, it's full. I mean, it's not
Was that a
quite.
pun?
It's not.
I'm sorry. No, it was a good one.
Yeah, sadly unintended. I wish I could take credit for it.
No, take credit for it.
But yeah, I mean, you know, that I'm not going to say they're as rampant as Starbucks, but they're not that far behind it. That they're definitely around for sure.
Okay, interesting. I kind of agree with you about the 90s thing because by that point I was a teacher here in England, so I'm starting to encounter what young people were saying about drugs because it's part of personal social health education and all that sort of thing. And of course, I was open. I was just like, I have no idea what any of this is about. You are going to have to tell me about it. I can remember having my first year class with year 10s where they were like, oh, so there's different, you can get speed from different docks because it's sold to us by sailors who come in from Russia or wherever, but it depends. It's named for each of the docks. So Immelman speed. This is in Lincolnshire, so it's like, okay. And then when I worked in the south, it was a whole other thing. But by this point, we were starting to move away from weed. It was much more about because clubbing, clubbing, dance music, that had all kicked off. So you were starting to see speed and ecstasy and all that sort of thing was becoming the in drug. So it definitely feels like a clear sort of we're out of date reference.
Yeah. When the downers are too successful, you got to bring in some uppers to offset it, right?
I don't know.
Sure.
Oh, I'll leave that to you, Dev.
Well, we just kind of turned this into Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Hunting out
exactly.
plans next. Yeah.
Yeah,
I do have some moves around here, so we can start day drinking with Seth.
Fear and Loathing in Grosse Pointe.
Yeah,
there we go.
Oh dear. Right.
But that would be like the only time that it feels like the movie dated language-wise, right? Because otherwise, it doesn't feel like it dated at all. Like,
yeah. I mean, we've said in early minutes, there's very few things in this film that really lock it into a place in time. There's a few elements of technology, specifically with like mobile phones, cell phones, and like landline phones, which feature a couple times. And there's a dog drinking a lot of water in the background. But
okay,
yeah,
hear it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, generally speaking, there's not that much that really locks this in a particular place and time. And as you say, right, like the language in general is pretty evergreen, which is kind of a nice feature for bringing this in for new folks. Except, of course, musically locks it very firmly in time, and the music is really what sets you where you are and is the most important part of this.
I actually googled the mobile thing because I was curious, because I don't remember seeing a mobile phone in a movie like that from that era. And the results were that mobile phones were invented in the 70s, but used in the 80s or started commercially. And I was really surprised because I thought like 90s were like the beginning of the mobile phones, but obviously they were around for longer.
What's the film about financial trading that came out of the 80s with, is it Michael Douglas?
Wall Street.
Wall Street,
yeah. So
Wall Street, Charlie Sheen.
Yeah. You'll see mobile phone usage in that, right? Because back then they were literally the size of a brick and pretty much the weight of a brick as well. And the only people that would lug them around were financial traders, sometimes lawyers that, couldn't bear to be separated from their precious work. And they didn't become more prevalent until the 90s into the 2000s as Nokia started getting those slimline phones, which is what we tend to think of as the first phones. Up until that point, if you really needed to be contacted, it was pager, which is something that I'm sure Hugh has a great deal of fun trying to explain to his students these days.
I don't
come up.
I just don't bother.
Dude, that is prime YouTube fodder right there. You film reactions to what the hell is this thing? You just give them one and then call the number and send the message and just watch their alarm as it starts vibrating.
They'd just be like, WhatsApp. And I'd be like, yeah, this is WhatsApp for a different generation. They're like, can you send a picture? No, sorry.
This was minute 72 of the Grosse Pointe Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your hosts, co-writers, co-producers, Dev Sodiger and Hugh David.
Today's guest and our guest all this week is Kosmas, film review extraordinaire. Kosmas, where can people find you online?
Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. Also IMDb, as you guys mention all the time. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It was a blast and awesome.
No worries. We'll see you on tomorrow's episode. You can find us at all good podcast players, as well as YouTube, X, and Spotify. In all cases, we're at Debi Radio as our handle, as well as our website, debiradio.com. All of those, Debi is spelled DEBI.
And if you want to talk with us, you can join us on the Facebook listeners group, Debi Radio 79.5 FM Fan Club.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time. It wasn't a moment